Hi, my name is John, and I am 26 years old. This is my second job. My job is a lighthouse keeper. I did not like it, but I had no choice. I chose it. That's a lot of nonsense. A lot of scary things happened. I'll tell you about it in Fog Fable. These are haunted lighthouse horror stories.
It was the sound of footsteps that first sent a chill down my spine, but what really terrified me was that I was completely alone. The lighthouse was isolated just the way I liked it, calm. I had always dreamed of working here, perched on the rocky coast with the endless ocean stretching before me, new keeper on my first solo shift. The thrill of it all made the salty air feel fresh. The only company I had was the constant crash of waves against the cliffs and the faint calls of gulls overhead. The night fell quickly. As I ascended the winding staircase to the lantern room, the cold air in the tower hit me like a slap. The beacon was already on, casting its beam over the restless sea. I adjusted the dials, ensuring the light was steady, then glanced down to the horizon. A storm was coming. Dark clouds rolled in from the distance, threatening to swallow up the world in shadow. The silence inside the lighthouse was comforting at first, but as the hours passed, it began to feel oppressive. I'd been awake for hours now, the isolation starting to play tricks on my mind. I went back to the lounge, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my thoughts. The small creaks and groans of the structure where normal old buildings always had their sounds. But then came the footsteps. I was sitting in the small lounge area downstairs, flipping through an old logbook. Every time I checked the upper floors, there was never anyone there. First, a piece of paper on the floor of the lounge, crumpled as if it had been dropped in a hurry. I opened it up, expecting to see a note, but all it had written on it were 3 words: "You are not alone." The feeling of being watched grew stronger as the hours passed. It was as if the whole building was alive with some hidden presence. I was sure I had locked up the tower, and besides, no one had been scheduled to relieve me for days. But then, the next morning, I found more. The fog had rolled in, thick and oppressive, so dense I could barely see the lighthouse from the base of the cliff. The footsteps had returned, this time louder and closer. It was a whisper, coming from somewhere inside the lighthouse. With every passing second, I felt something behind me, watching, waiting. The fog hadn't been disturbed, but the words were clear, each one appearing and vanishing, one after another. I squinted, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the mist, I saw words scratched out like an unfinished sentence appearing and fading. My breath was ragged, my hands trembling. I should have called for help, but the storm outside had made the radio static. The light in the room flickered, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Standing in the shadows, just out of reach of the light, I rushed up the stairs, heart pounding, my legs like lead. When I reached the top, I was met with a sight that chilled me to the bone. His eyes empty. There was no one on the mainland, no way to communicate. I stood, forcing my feet to move toward the staircase, my eyes flicking nervously between the door and the darkened hallway. A slow, deliberate sound of boots scraping against the wooden floor above. Louder. Closer. They echoed through the halls, closer to the stairs that led up to the lantern room. I felt a cold rush of air against my face, despite there being no open windows. But as I stepped out onto the wooden walkways, I saw something strange. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I reached the foot of the stairs. My heart skipped a beat. Just behind me, in the quiet corners of my mind, the warning still echoes. You are not alone. The radio still crackled with static, and there was no word from the mainland. The beam from the lantern illuminated the empty room. My eyes darted around, searching, but there was only the steady hum of the light and the deep, distant thrum of the storm. I stepped lightly, trying to make no noise, but the steps above me continued, as if someone was pacing in the upper rooms. Hello! My voice sounded foreign in the empty space. No answer. Just the echoes of my own words fading into nothing. I climbed the stairs quickly, my pulse rising with every step, but when I reached the top, there was no one there. It had to be my imagination, I told myself. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued throughout the night, steady and rhythmic, as though someone was walking in slow, purposeful circles. I tried to ignore it. But it wasn't just the footsteps anymore. I began finding things out. Things scattered around the lighthouse. My skin prickled. I tried to brush it off as some sick joke, maybe from a previous keeper. I went out to check the lower platform, hoping the fog would clear soon. The fog was swirling, almost as if it were being shaped by invisible hands. They are coming for you. I recoiled, heart racing. I had no idea how to explain it. I rushed back inside, slamming the door behind me. As I paced through the lighthouse, I realized I was no longer alone in my thoughts. Then I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, barely audible over the wind's howl. I froze. The voice was so close, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My body refused to move. And then the door to the lantern room slammed open, as if pushed by an unseen force. The beam from the lantern was still shining, but now there was someone else. A figure, tall, thin, and impossibly still. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his presence like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I stood frozen, unable to speak, as the figure took a step forward, then another, until he was almost in the light. "You've been warned," the figure whispered, his voice crackling like the wind outside. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The light returned to its normal, steady rhythm, and for the first time that night, I was left in silence. But the silence was worse than any sound. I tried to shake the fear, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But something in the air felt wrong. Something was different. As the hours ticked by, I began hearing the footsteps again. I wasn't alone. And I didn't know if I'd ever be again. The next morning, the storm finally cleared. The sun rose over the ocean, casting light onto the darkened lighthouse. I left the lighthouse, never looking back. But every night since, I hear those footsteps. The lights should have gone out hours ago, but as the storm raged on, I couldn't help but feel like the lighthouse was trying to tell me something. Something I wasn't ready to hear. It was my first solo assignment. The storm had rolled in unexpectedly massive black clouds, churning violently above the ocean, the wind howling through the cliffs like a wounded animal. This wasn't uncommon for old lighthouses. Sometimes the mechanism malfunctioned and the light stayed on longer than usual. The air smelled stale, like old salt water and rust. A strange feeling of abandonment. Everything was as it should be. Yet, the light didn't go out. I checked my watch 12:45 a.m. The storm outside howled louder, slamming against the walls like it wanted to tear the building apart. I didn't move at first, thinking it was just the storm. The glass was fogged, but I could see the shadows of something moving just outside the beam of light. A small, handwritten note tucked into the machinery beside the lamp. The paper was old, yellowing at the edges, with smudges of what looked like oil stains. But then it happened again. Tap, tap. It wasn't the rain. It was coming from within the lantern room. As I reached the lantern room, I was immediately struck by the intensity of the beam. It blazed across the waves, cutting through the storm, brighter than it should have been. There was nothing there. Just the crashing waves and the darkened, turbulent sea. I felt a sense of unease, something I couldn't place, gnawing at the back of my mind. The silence that followed the storm felt unnatural. There was no sound, no hum of the light, no crashing waves, just emptiness. He was tall, his face shadowed in the dim light, wearing a coat that seemed far too old. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his gaze, cold and piercing. The wind outside howled louder, and then I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't just a soft tap. It was frantic. I ran down the stairs, my heart hammering, and burst through the front door of the lighthouse. The storm outside had calmed, the waves now gentle against the shore. But I knew something was wrong. Something about the lighthouse, about the keeper who had never left. I found an old newspaper clipping, buried in a dusty archive, about a keeper who had vanished nearly 30 years ago. It was a strange case nobody ever found, and no clues as to his whereabouts. Considering how many years it had been since the lighthouse had been fully maintained. It wasn't just the storm that kept it burning. It was him, the keeper. And when the storm died down, the light still burned, as if to remind me that there are some things that never leave. I'd heard rumors, of course stories, about the old keeper, who supposedly went mad from the isolation. But no one had ever confirmed the truth. And the note? That wasn't something I expected to find. The door to the lantern room had swung open, creaking as it rattled in its frame. I stayed awake in the small coastal cabin, watching the lighthouse from a distance. I kept thinking of that figure, the one who had appeared out of nowhere, and the note, the keeper, never left. The storm outside rushed in with a cold gust, and I rushed to slam it shut. But as I stepped into the dim, eerie structure, something about it didn't sit right with me. They said it was likely just a mechanical failure, or that I'd imagined the figure. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew that lighthouse wasn't just haunted by the storm. I'd been assigned to the lighthouse on the outskirts of the coast, a place that had seen better days. Everything was in place, but the intensity of the light had lessened. The storm raged outside, but the lighthouse was no longer cutting through the dark with its powerful beam. It was as though the light was fighting back against something that didn't want it to shine. And with the storm picking up, I was the only one available to monitor it. The floorboards groaned and shifted with the wind outside, but there was something else, a low hum, almost imperceptible, coming from the light itself. It sounded like a whisper, and yet the storm outside drowned out any natural sounds. The light in the lighthouse was supposed to flicker out at midnight, but when I arrived, it was still burning bright. I made my way up the spiraling staircase, the sound of my boots scraping against the metal treads echoing through the otherwise quiet lighthouse. I checked the equipment, no malfunction there. The gears were functioning fine. The fuel was good. Still, the light stayed on. I sat in the corner, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. It felt as if the lighthouse itself was alive. Just as I was about to dismiss it as wind-induced paranoia, I heard a soft tap on the glass. I froze. I stood slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. I rushed over to the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I wiped it away. I turned back to the light, and that's when I saw it. The keeper never left. My breath caught in my throat. The keeper. This lighthouse, hadn't had a full-time keeper in years since. The last one? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stared at the words. I spun around. But when I turned back, the light had dimmed. I checked the machinery again. A chill crawled up my spine, and for a moment, I felt completely alone. Then, As the last flickers of the lighthouse lights sputtered, I saw him. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. He took a step forward, and then the light flickered back on, brighter than ever before. When I looked again, I didn't wait around to figure out what had happened. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I contacted the Coast Guard to report what had happened, but no one took me seriously. Weeks later, when I was finally able to return home, I decided to look into the history of that lighthouse and its previous keepers. The article ended with a chilling line. Some say the keeper still walks the tower, keeping watch over the sea. His light never fades. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. The light, the one that never faded. It wasn't just the storm that kept it burning. It was him, the keeper. And when the storm died down, the light still burned, as if to remind me that there are some things that never leave, not even in death. I never believed in ghosts, but the sound of that woman crying in the lighthouse still haunts me every time I close my eyes. The storm came out of nowhere. A sudden, violent gust of wind that capsized my boat within minutes. I had been out on the water just beyond the reach of the rocky coastline when the waves hit harder than I expected. The cold seeped into my bones as I crawled ashore, gasping for air. My heart hammering in my chest. I stumbled to my feet, dizzy and disoriented, but somehow managed to make my way up the rocky path toward the lighthouse. The boat flipped like a toy in a child's hands, and I was thrown into the freezing water. The old keeper had died mysteriously, his body never found. Since then, the lighthouse had stood empty, slowly deteriorating in the harsh winds and salty air. I looked up at the tower, the light that should have been long extinguished. The sobs echoed from within, the mournful cries cutting through the wind. I began to climb the crumbling steps that led to the entrance, each one more fragile than the last. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. The walls groaned as the building settled with age. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I stepped into the dimly lit entryway, my footsteps loud against the silence. The sobbing seemed to come from above, faint but insistent. The sobs echoed more clearly now, as if the woman were right inside the tower. Or perhaps a prank, though the thought of that didn't seem to make sense in the middle of nowhere. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was intruding on something wrong. But some deep, unshakable feeling drove me forward. The sobs weren't just sounds. They felt like something I could almost touch, a presence so strong that it made my skin crawl. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling as I examined it. Her figure was translucent, as though she wasn't entirely there. Her hair was disheveled, hanging in wet strands over her pale face, and her clothes were tattered as if they had aged with the years. The lantern flickered again, casting long shadows across the stone floor. With each step, the cries grew louder, more painful. The only thing I saw was the old lantern, still faintly glowing in the corner. The sobs, however, continued, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. I hesitated at the top, my hand on the rusted railing, listening to the sound of her sorrow. I fled down the stairs, out of the lighthouse, and into the night. I didn't know why, but the image of that woman haunted me, and I had to know more about her. I thought if I could learn her story, maybe I could lay her spirit to rest. I didn't stop until I was far away, back at the edge of the cliffs, the lighthouse towering in the distance. The storm had passed, but the dread in my chest didn't go away. She had been the keeper's wife. She had vanished without a trace, one stormy night, just like the man himself. She had been found by the water, her body cold and lifeless, drowned in the very waters I had washed up on. I swear I can still hear her sobbing into the wind, still waiting for the man she loved. The light from the lantern room flickered as if struggling against something unseen, and I think I'll always hear her voice calling to me. The lighthouse was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in, the only one who had walked away from that place. I don't remember how long I was in the water, but eventually I washed up on the jagged rocks near the base of the old lighthouse. But in the background, I noticed something strange. The storm had passed, but the unease was still there, gnawing at me. I searched the old keeper's records, diving deeper into the archives. That's when I found the truth. The silence in the room was suffocating, but there was no mistaking it. Something had changed. Her husband, the keeper, had never left. After her death, he refused to abandon the lighthouse, but he was never seen again either. A woman, standing just behind him, her face hidden by shadows. I hadn't seen her mentioned in any of the stories. She wasn't supposed to be there. It had been years since anyone had lived there. The place had been abandoned long before I was born. I knew that much. As I neared the lighthouse, I heard it. A soft, haunting sob. I froze. It was unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of a woman crying. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Was it the wind? Some kind of trick of the sound. I stood at the base of the lighthouse, the wind whipping around me, trying to locate the source of the sound. I couldn't understand why it was there. No one had lived in that lighthouse for decades. The crying grew louder, more desperate. It seemed to call out to me, pulling me closer. The door was slightly ajar, the wood creaking as I pushed it open. I was on T shore, What I was hoping to find, maybe. I thought it was some forgotten soul lost in the lighthouse. The staircase spiraled upward, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. When I finally reached the top, I was met with the sight of an empty room. There was no woman, no person in sight. I walked further into the room, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. And then, there it was, an old, tattered photograph lying on the ground. It was a picture of the lighthouse keeper, a man I had read about in the old news clippings. His face was stern, his expression unreadable. I stood up, the photograph still in my hand. The sobs had stopped. That's when I saw her. She wasn't crying now. She was standing at the doorway, staring at me with hollow eyes. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. She took a step forward, and then the light flickered back on, brighter than ever before. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't wait around to figure out what had happened. As I caught my breath, I looked back, half expecting to see her standing at the window, watching me. But there was nothing. I thought I'd escaped. Weeks later, I decided to return. I reached the lighthouse again, this time in daylight. The woman in the photograph wasn't just a shadow in the background. And the most chilling part, the woman's death wasn't the end of the story. The lighthouse. The lighthouse had become their tomb. Trapped in that place together, forever. I've never gone back since. And every time I hear the crash of the waves against the rocks, the lighthouse might be abandoned, but it's never truly empty.